Good evening, welcome to the Daily Agenda. I thought we'd have a departure from the norm this evening, and we're going to concentrate on the new movie. That's right, it's not Saturday night at the movies, it's Friday at the movies. And this time it's Nuremberg, with her Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, played by Russell Crowe. Brilliant performance as well, I might add, as it should be when dealing with a narrative of this nature. See, like every 15 to 20 years, they have to do a remake. And the reason why they do the remake is to remind the next generation of the narrative, and also to instill in them the understanding of what happens to them if they don't embrace the narrative. You know, I'm talking about the narrative that is the entire World War II history, for want of a better description. Now, the first place to start, I guess you could say, would be the Allies lied from the first day of the war to the last day of the war, and then we're supposed to believe that suddenly they started telling the truth at Nuremberg after the war was over. Well, it wasn't over. No, in actual fact, didn't Justice Jackson say that the war ends with this trial? So the trial was a continuation of the war. It was the official end of the war. Talking about war criminals, I mean, it's a very puzzling situation, isn't it? Very, very complex in truth, when trying to determine who and what is a war criminal. And in actual fact, who was really on trial at Nuremberg. Ostensibly, we were led to believe that the Nazi leadership, the NASDAQ leadership, was on trial. Because Nazi, of course, means redneck. It was in use long before the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterparty came into existence. It's just a common slang term in German called redneck. So the NASDAQ leaders were on trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and associated wrongs of every description. No international law to underpin it, just had to invent it on the hoof and apply it retrospectively. Does it sound like the two-tier justice system that we have in this country today? I'm sure it does. It sounds very familiar in actual fact. Rigged, loaded process. The possibility that any of the prime malefactors, so-called, were ever going to be acquitted or not receive the death penalty is just pure. You know, Göring, of course, boasted he would cheat the hangman, and he did with the cyanide capsule. But in truth, you know, talking of war crimes and war criminals, by that time the Americans had dropped 2 atom bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, which is a war crime, isn't it? A crime against humanity. The Americans and the British had also knowingly carried out terror raids, and they called them terror raids, on a raft of German cities: Hamburg, Cologne, notorious, and of course Dresden, where the debate continues to this day as to whether 200,000 or 400,000 people died in the firestorm. So they went in the first wave and dropped the eye explosives, which set fire to the city, and then the successive waves, British and American, went in and dropped the petrol-filled canisters. I remember Canadian pilots being interviewed about 20 years ago, I think it was, and they told the makers of the documentary, well, we had no idea what we were doing, Chuck. So you're flying over a burning city, and you're dropping petrol-filled canisters onto that burning city, and you have the audacity to tell someone that you have no idea what that petrol-filled canister will do when it hits ground zero in a city already on fire. Come on. That's war crimes. That is a crime against humanity. So, absolutely. And of course, the Soviet Union had murdered millions before the Second World War even began. The Red Terror. And of course, let's not forget the Holodomor. We mentioned the Holodomor previously, didn't we? When we were talking about that little clown who did the humiliation ritual in Israel recently. I think he calls himself Tommy Robinson, doesn't he? Stephen Lennon. Yes, absolutely. So, yes, that's the state of play where it comes to crimes against humanity. And of course, the Soviets had already had murdered 3 million Germans and raped millions of German women and raped some of them to death. Because even today, Vladimir Putin claims the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe. Liberated them from what? What form of liberty did any of them have? They lived under the brutal jackboot of the Soviet Union, and those who stepped out of line got their liberty in the afterlife, so to speak. Yes, of course, hypocrisy abounds everywhere, doesn't it? And so there's that classic scene where Goring, tells the shrink, well, I'm only here because we lost the war and you won. You don't have any moral superiority over me. Well, that's perfectly true, isn't it? Isn't it? Because anyone who believes that war isn't just murder is living in a dream world. That war isn't an atrocity full stop is living in the same dream world. That is what war is about. War is just an atrocious business. It's an atrocity. It's mass murder. Who was it who said that war doesn't determine who was right, only who's left? Yeah, very good point, in actual fact. So the film itself, yes, brilliant performance by Russell Crowe. Truly outstanding, in actual fact. But, all we're being reminded of is the narrative. And so what happens to people who question the narrative? Oh, well, they end up like David Irving, don't they? They get cancelled, subjected to the cancel culture that existed for decades before cancel culture erupted all over social media in these so-called liberal democracies that won World War II. See, Britain, of course, invented concentration camps, extinguished over 100,000 Boers in them to deny them any form of succour to the Boer commando. So, talking of war crimes, did anyone stand trial for that? No, they didn't, did they? Did any of these Soviets stand trial? In fact, if anyone should have stood trial at Nuremberg, it should have been the Soviet High Command, including that beast Stalin, that mass-murdering beast, psychopath. Absolutely. No, not at all. He was one of the conquering heroes, apparently, who put the NASDAQ leadership on trial and had most of them executed. Although Goring, of course, had the good sense to cheat the hangman's noose and totally humiliated the Allies in the process. Yes, absolutely. You might get a picture that I don't swallow the narrative here. You might think, my goodness, is this man on the side of the Nazis? No, I'm on the side of the truth. I'm on the side of the truth. War is a bloody awful, atrocious business, and it's an atrocity full stop. So for one bunch of mass murderers to call another bunch of mass murderers and guilty of war crimes is just like Fred West calling his nearest rival in serial killing a serial killer. You get the point I'm making? And talking about the US administration, that hideous entity has been responsible for the deaths of nearly 70 million people since the end of World War II in a succession of regime change operations, bombing campaigns, war, and more war. And that war just never ends. In fact, it's going on to this day, isn't it, in Ukraine, in many aspects of Ukraine. They're doing a replay of World War II. Exploited by the same old people. Yes, I think you know what I'm talking about, don't you? Of course, the bankers don't have to go to war, do they? And nor do their sons. They don't go to war. No. They don't carry out the war crimes. They just finance the war crimes. So, if anyone should have been on trial for crimes against humanity, surely it should have been the bankers who funded the First and Second World War. Or, those who crashed the stock market in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. I think we all know who I'm talking about, don't we? Surely you must know who I'm talking about. They were centrifugal in creating the State of Israel. Oh my crikey, let's not mention Israel, had we? Because that is another nation currently embroiled at the International Criminal Court for, war crimes. my goodness, it just never seems to end, does it? But apparently they're the noble ones. They're the chosen ones, apparently. Yeah, absolutely. And they're a very own little fairy tale. They're the chosen ones. And there's always a narrative. And we saw today with Edward Dutton, who's brought in the whole time to countersign the latest fantasies against the Nazi regime and, the NASDAQ regime. I do apologise for that slip. Freudian slip, was it? Or a Jungian slip. Yeah, I'm sure you get the message. But yes, absolutely. He was brought in to tell us that the latest research from DNA samples taken from the sofa of where he shot himself. This is a very important point I'm about to make now, so you should pay attention to this one. Don't miss it. Absolutely, it's better than the film. And you know why? Because it's not the narrative. This totally contradicts the narrative. So he was brought in and said, yes, from these DNA samples, they were able to determine that he had an unattended testicle, and this in turn caused him to have autism, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. All diagnosed after the fact by people who never met him. And of course, they relied on some of the testimonies of his former girlfriends. But we were told that Hitler just eschewed closeness and intimacy of any description. Didn't really like girlfriends. Now suddenly there's a flock of them. Goodness, honestly, the narrative just changes or does it change? No, it's entirely consistent because they just keep adding more to the narrative the whole time. This is the same Edward Dutton who told us recently that, Jonathan Bowden was a schizophrenic with a personality disorder. Didn't he also accuse him of having autism as well? and schizophrenia? Sound familiar? It's basically anyone that Dutton doesn't like, in other words, anyone who's not a centre-right degenerate, because let's face it, all of these centre-right leaders are degenerates. You see, to them, behaving like, as a junkie, using hookers, etc., using rent boys, and any other form of asocial degeneracy is just normal human behaviour. Anybody who doesn't do it's got a sociopathic personality disorder trait. I don't do it, so therefore I must be sociopathic. Yes, of course. According to a barrister who wrote a report about me, no training whatsoever in psychology, not even psychiatry, claimed I was a sociopath. I wiped the floor with him completely, sacked him, and he was forced to admit in court that he's professionally embarrassed. In other words, completely bloody corrupt. And that's what we're dealing with these people. When there is a nasty, malevolent political motive driving the gaslighting, everyone becomes a sociopath with schizophrenia, autism, bipolar personality disorder, and narcissism. Yes, of course. And, in the film, all of the Nazi leaders, the NASDAQ leaders have got personality disorders of some description. But all of the mass murdering Allied leaders, no, none of them have got personality disorders. Not even Joe Stalin, the biggest mass murderer, second only to Mao Zedong, the Cultural Revolution, the glorious Cultural Revolution. The reason why they use red, well, it's self-explanatory, isn't it? There's no such thing as blue blood. There's plenty of red blood there. And yes, absolutely. At times it's difficult, truly it is, to keep a straight face when talking about these people and their rampant, raging hypocrisy. It's just so utterly transparent. Should you watch the movie? Yes, absolutely. Why not? If you want to be entertained by the latest reiteration of the narrative, go ahead and do it. But before you watch the movie, perhaps you should be better advised to watch this review of it. Because it is just another recycled iteration of the narrative that they want you to believe. And if you don't believe the narrative and you question the narrative and you step outside the narrative, then you'll end up like David Irving. But that happened to me a long time ago anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me. Couldn't care less. In fact, shortly before my father died, he predicted that, they'd do to me exactly what they did to David Irving. Well, so what? Who cares? Do I look like I'm bothered? No. Oh, goodness, I'm wearing a light grey shirt. I mean, please don't think that that's in any way associative with the Luftwaffe, will you? Because they didn't wear light grey shirts. Before the clinical paranoia jumps in any further, So yes, of course, it's been a very interesting day watching all these weird and wonderful fairy tales circling around. I'm just waiting for Edward Dutton to produce a work claiming John Tyndall was a sociopathic, grandiose narcissist. That must be in the works somewhere along the line. And then, of course, he'll produce one about Nick Griffin called The Covert Narcissist, a corrupt degenerate, which will be totally true. And one thing all of these people seem to have in common is that these centre-right degenerates is that they all claim to be Christians. They all claim to be Christians. So what do Christians go around gaslighting other people, do they? Yes, of course they do. Whilst concealing all their own dirt and filth and disgusting behaviour and hypocrisy and pretending to be something that they're not. And as long as they go and dip their head in the, in the kitchen sink once in a while and pretend they've been baptised, born again, that's all good, because that crazy faith basically will allow you to do anything and to spout any old drivel, won't it? Surely it would. So how Christian is it to drop petrol-filled canisters on a burning city, knowing that you're going to burn hundreds of thousands of people into eternity, and then claim that's not a war crime, but the people who started the war apparently are war criminals? Do you get the point that I'm trying to make? I think I've made it quite well, in truth. I should imagine there'd be an awful lot of people spitting flames, watching this. That's cool. That's fine by me. I don't care. Absolutely. I couldn't care less, quite frankly. I'd just have a chuckle at it. It's very amusing. Spit whatever flames you want. But don't split them on Dresden, will you, or Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and then claim to be on a good guy and the other side's a bad guy. Do you get the point I'm making? And the most tiresome thing about the film, and it is very, very tiresome, like all the other recycled versions of it, and those to come will be exactly the same until we put a stop to this bloody nonsense, quite frankly, is the fact that there's a good guys and a bad guys, man. And Yankee Doodle Dandy and his little British bitch and his little French toe rag is, the good guy. The Germans, of course, are the bad guy. And the biggest bad guy of the lot, the Soviets, they're also the good guy. Well, kind of. When Yankee Doodle Dandy decides that they can be allowed to be a good guy. Because didn't Yankee Doodle Dandy also accuse them of being an evil regime? It's this was much later, Ronald Reagan, wasn't it? Or Ronald Reagan. Yes, it's hard to keep track of all these accusations and these slurs and the gaslighting, but the simple truth is all of these people are evil, aren't they? War in itself is an act of evil. There is no good that comes out of war. It's just a monstrosity, as far as I'm concerned. What I've seen of war is just hideous. Absolutely hideous. I don't believe that any side is the good guy or the bad guy. That it's just a narrative, that it's just a fiction. And in truth, this latest recycled version of Nuremberg is like a cowboy movie. We've got Pat Garrett, the good guy, going after Billy the Kid, the bad guy. Whereas in actual fact, Pat Garrett was also a crook, and Billy the Kid was, a crook, was he? Who knows? It all depends on who wins the gun battle, doesn't it? And that's simply the truth of the matter. Watch the film, but truly, it is just another, really, a tiresome incarnation of the narrative, recycled with a few bits of chippings of newness thrown into it. And then, of course, you have Ed Dutton to come along and say, oh, well, Hitler was this, Hitler was that, and Hitler was the other. And he had 3 personality disorders. Amazing how someone can have 3 personality disorders. How does that work? Clinically impossible, isn't it? Not when you're dealing with somebody with an axe to grind, with gaslighting. Now, of course, 30 personality disorders is possible with these people. Okay? And all this came from a DNA sample from the sofa where Hitler shot himself. Now, there's a massive stumbling block here, isn't there? Because Joseph Stalin told Truman and Churchill at Potsdam that he didn't believe Hitler had shot himself, and this was in July 1945, that he had in fact left Germany on a submarine and he was living either in Spain or Argentina, or that he'd gone to Argentina via Spain on a submarine, which totally contradicts the official line spouted by the Soviets and the Allies that he'd shot himself in the bunker. You know, they didn't even believe it themselves. That's a proven fact as well, what Stalin actually said at Potsdam. That's not opinion, that's not my opinion, that's a proven fact. And they didn't believe it. And the jawbone and the other bone fragments, which they claim they had in Moscow, were tested and proved to be no relation to Adolf Hitler or Eva Braun whatsoever. So why would we believe anything that comes out of any narrative about the Nuremberg war crimes trial? In fact, why would we believe a single allegation put to any of the defendants at Nuremberg, when we know for a fact all were dealing with incurable liars, and we're still dealing with incurable liars to this day? People like Edward Dutton, for example. I wonder if he'll get round to producing something about me. That's Simon Tomlin, yeah. Yes, he's got sociopathic personality disorder. Yeah, I totally agree with the Ben Birmingham barrister, another criminal crackpot. And yes, I believe he has ingrowing toenails caused by 6 undescended testicles, and which clearly caused him to have autism, ADHD, and every personality disorder under the sun. And you know what? The mongs out there will believe it because they're just dumb. That's what the lemmings do. The lemmings will swallow any old crap, quite frankly, because they're lemmings. They just sit there and slurp it down. Oh, it's all true. What we're being fed is true. What we're being told is true. You know, they just slurp it down like dopamine porridge. I don't. I never have done. In fact, the main reason why I made this video tonight is at 15 I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, and it taught me a great deal in actual fact. And when I went back to school, because this wasn't allowed on the school curriculum at all, you know, the teachers there said, no, that's beyond your reading ability. Beyond my reading ability, yeah, because I joined a book club, you know, and bought scores of books from that book club, 2 book clubs in actual fact, with my own money, which I earned at a butcher's shop, working part-time Wednesdays and Saturdays, and educated myself, only to be told it was beyond my reading age. What they really meant was it was a classic, act of projection, narcissistic projection. It was beyond their reading age, beyond their reading ability, quite frankly. And what I learned there was when you ask questions, you get excluded. And this is the reason why I got excluded at school. And good, because that was the best education I got. No education from that appalling shithole of a school called Eastwood Comprehensive School was the best education I could have got. And you know the reason why? Is because it made me go out there and educate myself. And that's why I'm able to this day to make videos of this nature and ask these questions and book the trend. And I don't swallow the dopamine porridge. So there you go. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. And by all means, ask your own questions. Don't let other people ask them for you. Good night.